The Albatross Brooch by Chris Trotter. It was a warm evening in Ias Nikolaos on the Greek island of Crete. Two women sat at a table in a bustling restaurant on the waterfront, drinking martinis, a mother and daughter on the eve of her wedding. The orange sun basked in the glory of its own reflection in the sea. It had been just the two of them all evening. Maggie reached for her mother's hand across the table and gave it a squeeze. "It's funny," she said. "Somehow I always knew I was going to get married on a Greek island." She laughed. "I love you," she said. "Thank you for an amazing evening. Thank you for bringing me here. I'm so happy." "Might I be allowed to make you even happier?" "Of course that's allowed," she said, laughing. "It's interesting you say you always felt like you would marry on a Greek island. I have something for you here that might just resonate with you." Her mother reached into the handbag at her feet and pulled out a little present tied with a ribbon. She placed it in front of her daughter. Maggie grinned and very gently began unwrapping the gift as if it were a delicate jewel. What was revealed was a small leather box. Maggie looked up at her mother, her face aglow with joy. "Now," said her mother, "do not open it. Sit back and listen. There's a story attached to this particular item of jewelry. Once you've heard it, you may open the box. Agreed?" "Agreed," replied Maggie, settling back in the cushions and taking up her martini again. "I'm all ears." "This belonged to my mother. She gave it to me on the eve of my wedding. It was made for her by a Grecian jewelry maker here in Crete. She stipulated in her will that it should be handed down through the female line. I thought this would be an appropriate time to let you have it." She picked up her own martini and took a small sip. "Your grandmother went to Oxford, as you know, and went on to be a very successful poet. She told me the story that I'm about to tell you in the dining hall at All Souls College, where she and I both studied." Crete, 1950. Lord Dunstan strolled leisurely towards Alunda harbour on a baking hot day in early June. The sea was a gorgeous turquoise blue, the boats rocked gently on the soothing swell, and children darted about in their bare feet, chasing each other in amongst the throng of people. Dunstan had come to Crete to indulge his interest in Greek mythology. Tomorrow he planned to visit Knossos, the setting for Theseus and the Minotaur. His wife had never shared his passion. She'd hated mythology almost as much as she hated heat, so their holidays had been spent at home in England. Ruth had passed away several years ago now, leaving him free to travel. His daughter Rebecca, their only child, was engaged to the fine Colonel Hardgrieves, and life was ticking along nicely. Under his arm he clutched a collection of English poetry. In his backpack were his Greek mythology books, his flask of whiskey, his binoculars, and his sketching kit. He could not have been happier. Suddenly somebody collided heavily with him. He dropped the book and almost fell over. "I'm so sorry, sir," said the young man, all in a fluster. He had been carrying a portfolio of work, which, like the poetry book, now lay on the ground. "No harm done," replied Dunstan. The man hastily began gathering up the drawings which had spilled out over the cobbles. They were of intricate designs, and they caught Dunstan's attention. "Those are beautiful," he said, reaching down to recover this book. "Oh, they're just my work, nothing special." "May I?" asked Dunstan. The young man looked at him a trifle awkwardly and then straightened up. "Of course," he said, handing over the folder. Dunstan began flicking through them, but slowly, taking time to look at each drawing. "They're superb," he said, mesmerized. The young man smiled sheepishly and shrugged. "English poetry," he said, pointing to the book under Dunstan's arm. "I love poetry." Dunstan looked at him. "So do I. It gives me great pleasure." He managed to extend a hand. "George Dunstan," he said. The young man smiled and shook it. "Petros Andreas," he replied. "What exactly is your line of work, Petros?" "Oh, I design and make jewelry." He smiled sadly. "Not much at the moment. There's not a lot of work out there." "In which case, may I buy you a cup of coffee? I have a proposition for you." They sat down at a table outside the open doors of a cafe. Dunstan ordered a small black coffee for himself and a glass of raki for Petros, who set his folder down in front of him, removed a blank sheet of paper, and took a pencil from his pocket. "So, Mr. Dunstan, what would you like?" "A brooch," From my daughter, Rebecca." He slid a small photograph of a woman across the table to him. "In 2 months, she will be marrying her fiancé, Roger Hardgrieves. He's a colonel in the British Army. Never was there a more splendid couple. My daughter has grown into a charming young woman with many wonderful attributes." Petros gazed at a pale-complexioned woman in fine clothes, sitting next to a pot plant. She was stunning. High cheekbones, slender curves, a mass of dark hair gathered at the nape of her neck. "It is these attributes that I would like you to bear in mind when you design this brooch. This is my wedding present to her, and it must be flawless. I will pay you generously, my friend. Make no mistake about that. I am a very wealthy man." Petros drew his eyes away from the photograph and handed it back to Dunstan. "What are these attributes, sir?" "Kindness, compassion, determination, strength, beauty, endurance. She's also very spiritual." Petros was writing these down. "I want these elements of her nature to be represented in your design." "I understand, sir. How long do I have to make it?" "I leave in 2 weeks." Petros nodded. "You said you had no other commissions." "No, that's fine," he said. "I can do that for you." He scratched his chin. What kind of price are we talking here, Mr. Dunstan?" Dunstan quoted him a large sum of money. "What materials would you like me to use, sir?" "Silver. She prefers that. Perhaps with a precious stone like a ruby. Can you get your hands on one of those?" "I know someone who could get one for me. However, he would want the payment up front, and unlike you, I am not a wealthy man, Mr. Dunstan." Dunstan nodded. "I will pay you a deposit. How does that sound?" "Perfect," replied Petros. Dunstan removed a checkbook from his pocket. When the details had been finalized, the two men prepared to part. "I would like to be updated in about a week on how it's coming along. Where and when can I meet you?" Petros gave him an address and a time. They shook hands once more. "I look forward to seeing you again, Mr. Andreas." "Likewise, sir. And thank you." "My pleasure." "I will do a good job for you." "I am counting on it," said Dunstan good-humouredly. "Here," he said, handing Petros the poetry book. "Take this. You said you liked poetry. I will collect it when I see you next." "Thank you," said Petros. He handed Dunstan his portfolio, keeping back the latest design. "Take these. You said you liked them." Dunstan chuckled. "I will see you in a week," he said, and they parted. Karina Andreas sat hunched in a rocking chair in the shaded apartment, waiting for her son. He was late. She was nursing a bandaged leg, which had to be checked regularly. She had developed an infection, an inflammation of the skin on that particular leg. Pustules kept forming, which became very painful if they weren't drained. The doctor had instructed her son, Petros, on how to drain these pustules, but she kept complaining that he wasn't doing it properly. The front door suddenly opened and closed again. Petros came into the room. "Where have you been?" she growled. "I'm sorry, Mother. I was waylaid. How's your leg today?" "Painful," she snapped. "Let me have a look." He carefully unwrapped the bandages and examined the skin. It did not look good. There was gauze at a metal petri dish on a little table by the window, along with a slim surgical knife for cutting the pustules, fresh bandages, and cream. He now began the horrible task which he had been forced to perform every day for the past few weeks. But this was not the first problem with his mother, and it wouldn't be the last. She'd been an invalid for many years now, ever since his father had died. It was as if she had just given up. Now her days were spent in that dark apartment with the shutters closed to keep out the searing afternoon sun. She never went out any more. Her friends rarely came to see her. All day she would sit in that rocking chair with a tiny radio for company. "I got a commission, Mother. A good one. That's why I was late. I'm going to make it one day, Mother. Just you wait." She scoffed. "I've heard that before." "No, I mean it. I'm going to make a success of myself. I'm going to make you proud." "It would take a hell of a lot more than that to make me proud of you, Petros." Petros stopped what he was doing. "Why do you have to say those things, Mother?" he said, keeping his eyes to the floor. She didn't answer. Petros carried on. "I try my best. I've always tried my best. I understand you wanted great things for me, Mother. I do. I'm just not cut out for that. My passion is creating. Creating what? You silly little designs. That's what ruined your father. Him and his bird paintings. Nobody bought them, and nobody wants yours. But you don't seem to get that message. If you don't pull yourself together, you're going to be stuck on this island for the rest of your life. Petros stood up. There, he said sharply. All better. Petros left his mother's apartment and walked angrily back down the hill a short way to his own little house, with a corrugated roof and weeds sprouting out from between the old stones. He strolled in and slammed the door. He stood for a moment, surveying the room before him. A bed in the corner, table and 2 chairs, a stove with a rickety pipe ascending through the roof, and his workspace, cluttered with tools and drawings. This is all he owned in the world. Maybe his mother was right to be ashamed of him, but she could be so hurtful when she was in one of her moods. How could she say those things of her own son? It was hardly his fault that his older brother Homer had died in the prime of his youth. Homer had been a brilliant scholar and destined for great things. Petros was never quite as good as Homer, and when he died he knew that the general consensus was that it should have been Petros. During the war she had told him to enlist, because he was so incompetent he would probably be the first to die. They did not speak after that for a whole month. His father had been a painter. That's where he had got his creative flair from, but as his mother had said, he had hardly sold anything. The biggest break he ever had was when an Oxford professor had bought a whole load of his paintings. But his career never really came to anything, and he ended up drinking himself into a somewhat premature grave, though not quite as premature as his eldest son. He slowly moved forward into the room. He placed the piece of paper on his worktop and lay down on his bed. He closed his eyes and fell asleep. When he woke, it was early evening, and the sun was low in the sky. He rose slowly and went over to the stove. Next to it was a stone sink. He filled the kettle with water and put it on the hob. Then he opened his back door into a very small quadrangle, where there lay a cast-iron tub, and dragged it inside. He filled the tub half full of water, then removed his clothes and stepped in, where he washed standing up. He left his house and walked down towards the harbour. The air was balmy. He was heading for a local bar which he frequented most evenings. It was the one thing that kept him from going crazy. When he arrived, he ordered a carafe of cheap wine and sat in his usual seat. The bar looked out at the bay and was only covered with a wooden roof. Other than that, it was open to the elements. Acastus came to join him. "I was going to come and see you later this week," said Petros. "Really? For what?" "I need a ruby." "What size?" "Small." "Rubies are expensive." "Maybe too expensive for a man such as you, Petros." "It's not my money. I have an important commission." "Oh?" Petros nodded, taking a long sip of wine. "A rich Englishman, as it happens, wants me to create a brooch for his daughter, made out of silver." "I can sell you silver too," said Acastus. "I'll do you a special price." "Thank you. Moving up in the world, are you, Petros?" Petros shrugged. "Maybe." "Come by and see me tomorrow," said Acastus. Petros left the bar 4 hours later. It was dark now. He walked slowly along the waterfront, listening to the little waves lapping against the rocks. The night air was still warm. When he got in, he went to his worktop and sat down. He read the list of attributes Dunstan had said his daughter possessed. He took another piece of paper and began scribbling some designs in it. None of them were very good, and he gave up after about half an hour and went to his bed. But he couldn't sleep. He lay awake for at least the next 2 hours, staring into the darkness. Oxfordshire, England. Rebecca was standing on the veranda, looking out over the garden. In her hand she held a cigarette. The white cigarette paper was almost as pale and as slim as the fingers that held it. She was in despair. She had nothing in common with Roger. They were worlds apart. So why did her father think they were a perfect couple? Because they looked so elegant together? Or because father was impressed simply by his status and because he had money? Of course, it was all of these things. She may have still been young, but she wasn't naive. This was how the game was played. But it was a cruel game. Her father was taking her future by the scruff of the neck and assuming control of it. She didn't hear Roger come up behind her. "Ah, my darling, you look ravishing this evening." He kissed her on the cheek, then took the cigarette from her and put it between his lips. "I was smoking that," she said, without turning round. "And now you've given it to me. That's what a relationship is all about. Sharing." And with that he went back inside to the library. Rebecca followed him. He seated himself at a low table and took up the glass of brandy he had been drinking and the newspaper he had been reading. "Close the door, will you, darling? It's too stuffy in here." "Whatever you say. Your father will return in a week or two anyway, and he'll want his library back. He seems to spend his life in here, with his nose buried in those books. He needs to get out more, if you ask me." Rebecca sat down opposite him. "I wanted to ask you about the honeymoon." "What about it?" he asked, not looking up. "You still haven't told me where we're going. Don't you think I should know by now?" He folded away the newspaper now and leaned forward, smiling at her. "I'm taking you to Athens." Despite herself, Rebecca gaped at him. "Are you happy, my darling?" asked Roger. She laughed. "Yes, I am very happy. I can't think of anywhere more romantic. And while we're there, we can drop in an old army chum of mine. In fact, he's expecting us." The smile faded from Rebecca's face. "An army chum?" "Yes, a colonel like myself. He's stationed out there. He'll put us up for a couple of weeks." "A couple of weeks? This is meant to be our honeymoon." Roger sat back and picked up his brandy. "I haven't seen him in years. I thought it'd be nice." "This is our honeymoon, dearest. You didn't consult me." Roger banged his glass down so heavily on the tabletop that he splashed brandy all over the place. Rebecca froze. "I don't like it when you make me angry," said Roger in a low, menacing voice. "It's been happening rather too often at the moment." "I'm sorry," said Rebecca quietly. "I would remind you that in 2 weeks you'll be my wife, the wife of a colonel. I will be expecting you to behave as such. Do you understand?" She nodded. "I understand. Excuse me." She left the library and went to her room. She sat down on the large double bed with its posh draperies and burst into tears. She tried to stifle them so he wouldn't hear. Roger didn't like her crying. He said it made her look weak. She had no idea what to do. She felt so trapped and so alone. She went over to her dressing table and picked up a book of poems. When she was upset, she would read them. As a child, her father had read poetry to her before she went to sleep. She had grown to love it. She studied many of them in school and subsequently at Oxford. It was while at university that she had been recommended a poem by one of her professors. She had asked him to help her find a poem with an albatross in it, and he had pointed her in the direction of The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. She turned to it now. "It is an ancient mariner, and he stoppeth one of 3. By thy long grey beard and glittering eye, now wherefore stoppest thou me? The bridegroom's doors are open wide, and I am next of kin. The guests are met, the feast is set, mayst hear the merry din." How appropriate, said Rebecca. Petros threw back the covers and got out of bed. He paced around the room a few times and then went out onto the small balcony through a pair of slatted doors. The sky was ablaze with stars. They had an orange tinge to them. It was like God had lit a huge bonfire and the sparks had been blown across the heavens. As he looked, he saw a glowing ball with a fiery tail go rippling through the stars. He smiled. Why couldn't he sleep? Was it because of what his mother had said to him? Was he nervous about the big commission? This was his chance to prove himself, to his mother, and to the world at large, the world that lay beyond this arid island. Or did he just want to prove it to her, to this stranger's daughter? And what exactly did he want to prove? That he could make a pretty brooch for her? He shook his head. He went back to his workspace and picked up the piece of paper. He read each attribute silently, and then he read them again out loud. Kindness, compassion, determination, strength, beauty, endurance, spiritual. How does one put all these things into a brooch? He began repeating the list over and over, walking around the room with it, saying it in different tones, emphasizing particular words. He went on like this for perhaps half an hour, until he had drummed the list into his head. When the sun rose, he left his house and took himself off for a walk. He walked up into the hills above the town, all the time repeating those words out loud. Everywhere he went that day, everything he did with those attributes swirling around in his head. When he attended his mother, he barely spoke to her, just kept muttering to himself. He went to see Acastus about the materials. "How's the design coming along?" asked Acastus. "There is no design at the moment. I haven't managed to come up with one yet. But I'll take the silver anyway." At 4 o'clock he was back at his workspace, scribbling away furiously. But nothing flowed. It didn't seem natural or right. Something was wrong. Piles of scrumpled up pieces of paper were forming around his feet. Only 2 days ago his designs were amazing and varied. Now there was a blockage of sorts. He couldn't work out what it was. He slept a few hours, then went out for dinner in the evening. He ate in a little square surrounded by carpet shops. He often ate here, admiring the designs and patterns on the rugs. They sometimes gave him inspiration for his own work. 2 huge trees grew in the centre of the square, and the constant and monotonous sound of cicadas filled the tempered air. When he had finished eating, he sat drinking raki and staring at the candle in front of him. What was wrong? At that moment, one of the young waitresses walked past him. She was clearing the tables, and her long, dark hair fell about her shoulders as she leaned over to pick up the glasses. Petros found himself staring at her, except that he wasn't seeing the waitress. He was seeing the girl in the photograph, Rebecca. Petros did not have a lot of experience with women. He had always been a shy boy, unlike his brother. He preferred to keep to himself rather than fraternize with anybody, least of all the opposite sex. And no girl had ever shown an interest in him. He was 24 years old. He sipped his raki and imagined how Rebecca would seem in real life. Her confident stride, her kind smile, her beautiful looks. How would she speak to him? Compassionately? Spiritually? Would that strength and determination be apparent in her body language? Later, he sat on his bed and opened the book of poetry Dunstan had lent him. He read several of them, before he came to the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. Rebecca sat in an armchair on the veranda with a book in her lap and the slither of a crescent moon high above her. The sun came up upon the left. Out of the sea came he, and he shone bright, and on the right went down into the sea. Higher and higher every day, till over the mast at noon, the wedding guest here beat his breast, for he heard the loud bassoon. The bride hath paced into the hall, red as a rose is she, nodding their heads before her goes the merry minstrels see. "What are you reading?" Rebecca looked up. "The Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. It's my favourite." Roger squatted down beside her. "I am sorry I snapped at you last night. I was wrong to do so. I suppose I am a little on edge at the moment about the wedding." She put her hand on his. "I just want there to be time for us, by ourselves, with nobody there to disturb us. Isn't that what you'd like? To have me all to yourself?" She kissed him. "You are right. Of course you are right. You know how we army fellows are, always like the company of our comrades. We will stay a few days and then do our own thing." She nodded in agreement. When he had gone, she sat back in the chair and sighed heavily. She was trying desperately to avoid another outburst, and had been tiptoeing around him all day. It wasn't just the disappointment of the honeymoon that was getting to her. It was the fact that he believed he owned her, that she was not free to make her own decisions, even down to the clothes she wore. Her wedding dress had been scrutinized by him before he gave his approval. She had to look good beside him, not because he cared about her, but because he cared only about himself, and about how he looked if his wife didn't look right. That would show him up in front of his men, and that could never do. The wedding guest, he beat his breast, yet he cannot choose but hear, and thus spake on that ancient man, the bright-eyed marineer. It was a long poem, a very long poem, about a mariner who shoots an albatross and breaks bang luck upon his crew. When Petros had finished reading it, he lay back and soaked it all in. Its sound was beautiful. It flowed like a river of wine in his mind. He had inherited his father's love of birds, and would often go out and sketch them in his pad. He had read up about the albatross in an ornithology book a long time ago, but he couldn't remember now. For the next 2 days he worked on many designs and never settled on any of them. He knew what the problem was now. Nothing he did came up to scratch. He sat up all night drinking raki and grinding his pencils down to the end. It had to be perfect. It had to look great on that wonderful bust of hers. He couldn't get her out of his mind now. The photograph was constantly there, her stunning features. Was she the kind of woman who could like a man like him? A man with no prospects, no money, nothing to offer her but his talents, which, according to his mother, were worthless. Would she have compassion for him? He walked a lot during that first week. He looked at things, boats, fishing nets, the cobbles on the road, anything to give him the inspiration he so desperately needed. And everywhere he looked he saw her face, or was reminded of her in some way. He was beginning to lose his head. He'd stopped going to see his mother and her inflamed leg. He didn't speak to anybody. He spent most of the day in his little house, and when he wasn't there, he was out walking. One afternoon, the day before his meeting with Dunstan, Acastus found him wandering aimlessly in the hills, talking to himself, with a bottle of raki in his hand. "What are you doing to yourself?" he asked his friend. "I'm in love, Acastus." "That's wonderful. With who?" "With the woman I'm supposed to be making this brooch for." "But you've never met her." "Exactly, Acastus. I've never met her. Instead, I'm in love with a photograph, an idea. I see her face everywhere, in the rocks, in the sea, in the sky. I'm cursed." "You're drunk." "I've only been drunk for an hour." He swallowed another swig of raki. "Who am I, Acastus? What am I doing here? What am I doing with my life?" He paused. "She's the most perfect being I've ever set eyes upon. She's everything that I want, everything that I've ever desired." Tears rolled down his dusty cheeks. "I wanted to love my brooch. I wanted to love me. I want to feel her compassion. I wanted to give me some of that determination and strength, because I have none of it. Look at me, Acastus. What have I got? Nothing. I have nothing. Nothing but the clothes I stand up in and the drawings I produce. My own mother's ashamed of me. My mother. I want somebody to appreciate me, Acastus, to hold me in their arms and tell me that I'm not worthless. I want Rebecca. But I can't have Rebecca, because she's marrying Colonel Hardgrieves in 7 weeks from now. I can't cope with that, and that's why I'm drinking raki." Acastus tried to persuade him to go home, but without success. He left without his friend, and Petros lay down in the dust and subsequently lost consciousness. When he awoke it seemed dark, but it was only because storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. He staggered to his feet. His raki bottle was empty. Thunder rumbled over the sea, and a thick mist was rolling inland. He was approaching the cliffs. When he reached them, he stood on the edge and looked out at the dramatic piles of dark clouds that were moving ever closer. If he just kept looking straight, he wouldn't see the ground rush up and strike him. It would be over in an instant, and then no more pain. There weren't many people who would miss him. Lightning flickered in the clouds, illuminating the fog. And as he saw that flicker, he heard it, in that warped mind of his, a soothing voice that flowed like a river of wine. At length it crossed an albatross. Through the fog it came, as if it had been a Christian soul. We hailed it in God's name. The lightning flickered again, and a gust of wind hit him in the chest, and a good south wind sprung up behind. The Albatross did follow, and every day for food or play came to the mariner's hollow. The Albatross, the good omen for sailors, a powerful bird that can glide for hours without food or rest, a beautiful bird. Petros turned and started running down the hill. "I've got it!" he screamed. "I've got the design! She is the Albatross! Beauty, strength, endurance, determination to cross those oceans, a good spiritual omen. She is compassion. She saved me. Just as I was about to throw it all away, she came out of that fog. You are my good omen, Rebecca Dunstan." George Dunstan knocked on the door and waited. A few moments later, it opened a fraction, and a bleary-eyed Petros stuck his head out. "Good morning, Mr. Dunstan." Dunstan stared at him. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." "How's the brooch?" "It's coming along nicely. I have to go now. Bye." The door closed again. Dunstan stood there for a moment, then knocked again, a little harder this time. Again the door popped open, and Petros' tired face appeared. "Excuse me, Mr. Andreas, but I came here to see the progress, not to be told about it. You can't come in. You can't disturb me. But we'll see it in a week. Oh, by the way, your poetry book helped enormously. Thank you." Dunstan sighed. "Do I have your word that I will see it in a week?" "Of course. I said I'd do it, and I'll do it. I've just been having a few teething problems, but I will get it done." "Can I at least see a drawing?" "Just a minute." Petros disappeared inside, but emerged again with a piece of folded-up paper. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have got to get back to work." Again the door closed. Dunstan sighed and shook his head. Then he opened the folded paper and looked at the design. "My God," he exclaimed. Petros went back to his work counter and sat down. The room was a mess. Paper scattered around his chair, his bedsheets unmade, empty wine and raki bottles lying on the floor. But in the middle of all that chaos, something magnificent was forming. The next day, Acastus was surprised to see him. "How are you, my friend?" he asked. "I need that ruby." When Dunstan finally returned to collect his poetry book and his daughter's wedding gift, Petros opened the door to him a lot more politely than he had done a week before. Petros had bought a little leather box to put it in, which he now presented to Dunstan. He opened it. "I must admit, a week ago I had my doubts, but this is more beautiful than I could ever have imagined. My sincere thanks to you." He shook his hand warmly. "It was my pleasure. I only hope she appreciates it." "Oh, I'm sure she will. Here's your payment and your drawings." "Thank you. Please write to me and let me know." "Of course," said Dunstan. "Let me give you this address," said Petros. He went back inside and scribbled it down. "Here." He handed the address over with the poetry book. "And please, give my best wishes to Rebecca." That night, Petros slept on his balcony in his underwear. It was too warm inside the house. He lay with his head on a pillow, looking up at the stars. What would she make of it? Would she love his work? Would she think of the man who had made this magnificent brooch? Because he thought of her every day. He was obsessed by her. She was his Albatross. They were linked together in fate. If he had not bumped into her father that day, he would never have known she existed. He smiled to himself now. She will wear the brooch that I made with my own hands. I made it. For her. Somehow that notion had given him a sense of peace and fulfillment. You have cast away that fog, Rebecca Dunstan. You will fly forever above me. A month later, a letter arrived from England for a Mr. Petros Andreas. It read thus: Dear Mr. Andreas, I had to write and thank you personally for the wonderful brooch that you have made for me. It is truly the most beautiful piece of jewellery I have ever seen. I have never seen such skill, such attention to detail. I will treasure this for the rest of my life. With thanks again, yours sincerely, Rebecca Dunstan. Tears choked Petros as he read the letter over and over again. A personal letter from his Rebecca. The embossed address at the top of the page read, The Martins, 12 Eves Lane, Chipping Norton, Oxfordshire, England. Rebecca laid down the pen and folded the letter neatly before slipping it into the envelope. She looked at the brooch that lay in its box and carefully lifted it out. She cradled it in her hand. 2 albatrosses, their heads side by side. Nestled between them was a brilliant ruby. It reminded her of something. But of course, the ancient mariner. She went to find her father, who was in the billiard room. Father, was this your design? I gave him a few things to consider, said Dunstan, smiling at her. Did you tell him about the ancient mariner? Dunstan laid aside his cue. No, but I gave him my poetry book to read, and he said it helped him greatly. It must have been that poem he was reading. Rebecca smiled at him knowingly. That's quite a coincidence, don't you think? And nothing more, my dear, replied Dunstan. Are you happy with it? You know I'm happy with it, you silly old fool. Ancient, he said. She went back to her room and closed the door. Roger was at the barracks, and she had time to relax and be herself for a little while. She sat in the chair by her dressing table and admired the Albatross brooch. It was the most perfect thing she had ever seen. He had made it for her, and he had read her favourite poem from her father's own book. Was it just coincidence, or had he been told to read it? Whatever the truth, whoever Mr. Andreas was, he was a much gentler soul than her Roger, who could never have created something like this, even if he tried. Coincidences? Did she really believe in them anyway? Was there such a thing as fate? The night before her wedding, Roger was again at the barracks, and Rebecca was dining with her father. How are you feeling? He asked her. Rebecca laid down her knife and fork. To be honest with you, father, I'm not sure. Dunstan nodded slowly. He is a fine man, yes, you have said that many times. But I cannot see those fine qualities in him, father. Dunstan said nothing. He simply stared into his daughter's impassioned eyes. I don't know what to do. I am marrying a man I do not love. You should have told me, said Dunstan. And what would you have done about it? I know how much you like Roger, and I knew that all you were trying to do was make me happy. Yes, that's right. That is all I have ever wanted for you. Nothing more. I wouldn't have cared whether you married a rich man or a poor man, as long as you were content. They sat in silence for a moment. Perhaps if there was better communication between the two of us, we might have got it right. Is it just me, or since Mother died, have we not spoken properly to each other? Dunstan put his chin on his knuckles and stared at the polished tabletop in front of him. What was it, do you think, that stopped us? Were we too afraid that one of us would talk about her? Dunstan began to cry. Rebecca got up from her seat and came round the table towards him. She put her arms around her father. He held her hand. I'm sorry, he said. I did not think for 1 minute that you would not like him. I assumed you got on well with each other. I wanted so much for you. We both did, your mother and I. I know, she whispered. It is nobody's fault. We did get on at first, but before I found out what he really was like, domineering, angry, self-centered, I didn't want to disappoint you. I wanted to show you I could play the game. What game? What are you talking about? The society game, the one the rich people play. Good God, Rebecca, is that what you thought? That this was a game? This is not a game, Rebecca, this is your future. I would never, ever presume to... He banged his fist on the table. Do you think that's what my life has been up until now? One big game which I play with the highest bidders? Rebecca didn't respond. Dunstan wiped his eyes and squeezed her hand. I am sorry. Don't be. She kissed his forehead. So what do I do? That night she lay alone in her bed and thought about a Grecian stranger. She imagined dark flowing hair, soft tan skin, tender hands. Rebecca was usually a woman of sense, but occasionally she liked to dream. She knew she was privileged. She had been to the best university in the land, had been born to devoted parents who could and give her everything. But the one thing she desired more than anything else was a husband. Somebody who would love her and care for her. Somebody who would look after her and whisper that she was sweetness and light. Somebody who appreciated the same things as she did. Roger was not that man, and he never had been. For weeks now she had gazed at this brooch, had sat and read the poem with it. It was perfect. It was the best wedding present she could ever have asked for. Every time she saw it, it gave her a feeling of immense peace and happiness. A strange vibration had been rising in her chest. This man, this mysterious stranger from a small Greek island, whom she had never met in her life, was becoming everything to her. Why? Because she was unhappy? Was she clutching at a foolish romantic notion because she was in a desperate situation? And this link with the poem, the image of the albatross, the good omen of mariners, was he her omen? She lay back and whispered to herself now. What delicate fingers have put this thing together? Which eyes have watched it form? What mind has ruffled this albatross feather? Whose heart will now be torn? At 11 o'clock the following morning, Rebecca held her breath as Roger slipped the ring on her finger. With her other hand, the one she held behind her back, she crossed two of those fingers. That same evening they were on their way to Athens, speeding through the French countryside in a first-class carriage. Are you happy, my darling? Roger asked her as they sipped champagne. Very happy, she replied. They arrived in Athens 3 days later, and went immediately to the house of Roger's friend, who gave them a very warm welcome. But they did not stay there for a few days, because Roger liked his company so much that a few days turned into an entire week, and did not look like abating. At the end of that first week, she confronted him. Well, I'm glad you're enjoying yourself, Roger, dear, because I am far from being happy. A few days, you promised me. This is not our honeymoon, this is your leisure time. Roger was getting changed to go out with his friend into the centre of Athens for a night of relentless drinking. These drinking sessions had been frequent, and had ended with Roger and his friend coming home drunk and loud-mouthed in the early hours of the morning. Roger had a cigarette in his mouth as he put his shirt on. Is this how you would want your men to see you, out of your face on drink? What time can I expect you back this time? 3 o'clock? Or why not make it 4? Or 5? It doesn't really matter. Roger was ignoring her. Is this what I'm going to have to put up with for the rest of my life with you? He took the cigarette from his mouth and blew smoke in her face. How dare you treat me like this? I'm your wife! He moved too quickly for her to do anything about it. He slapped her hard across the cheek, and she fell against a chair. He grabbed both her arms. Don't ever speak to me like that again, bitch! Yes, you are my wife, and therefore you will do as I say. Love, honour, and obey. That is your duty. I will do as I please. Do you understand me? Yes, she whispered, her whole body shaking with fear. He left her on the floor and carried on dressing. When he was done, he marched out without looking back. Rebecca burst into tears as soon as he had gone. She stayed where she was on the floor and didn't move. She cried for a full hour. Dear God, she whispered now. Help me. I am so scared. Show me your light. Where is it? What is your answer? Speak to me. Her eyes had been closed as she spoke these words. When she opened them, she was looking at the carpet. Something was lying there. It shone under the lamp. It was the Albatross brooch. Rebecca shoved clothes into her bag and left the house as quickly as possible. Adrenaline coursed through her body. She got a taxi to this train station. 1 ticket to Le Vrion, please. A return, madam? No, she replied. There is a train in 40 minutes. I will get you on that. She took her ticket and found a seat in the waiting area. What was she doing? Was this madness? He didn't even know her. She had brought the slip of paper with this address on it, hidden in her purse. She should have left sooner. She could taste blood in her mouth. She would never go back to him after this. 40 minutes seemed like a lifetime, but eventually the time came to board the train. She watched it pulling in through the stream, the train that would take her to the coast. From there, she would cross by ship to Crete. At that moment, two men emerged from a bar near the ticket kiosk. "You know, Roger, it's always an adventure drinking with you." Roger laughed heartily, and then his gaze fell on a woman on one of the platforms. She was boarding a train. Nothing strange in that, except that this woman was the spitting image of Rebecca. Good God, that's Rebecca, just getting on that train. Where the hell is she? He bolted towards the platform, but he was too late. The train was starting to move. "What train is that?" he asked one of the guards. "That is the train to Le Vrillon, sir, on the coast. Is everything all right?" Roger was seething. "No," he said through grated teeth. "It most certainly is not." He ran over to the ticket kiosk. There was a queue. He waited impatiently for his turn. "Get me on the next train to Le Vrillon." "I am afraid that train is all booked up, sir." "Damn it!" "There are spaces on the 8:30, though." As the train rushed along faster and faster, Rebecca felt more and more relieved that she was getting as much distance as she could between her and Roger, while at the same time nearing something different, something far more exciting than a life as a colonel's wife. She was going on an adventure. The train pulled into Le Vrillon 2 hours later. She was exhausted. She found accommodation and settled down for the night. But Roger was on her trail. He had boarded his train and was now only an hour behind her. What the hell was she up to? He would find out soon enough. A beautiful young woman like Rebecca would not go unnoticed. He would find her, and when he did, he would have questions for her. Rebecca sat in a warm bed in a small, cosy little room just next to the harbour. Her window looked out over the boats. She sat with a pad of paper and a pen which she had borrowed from reception, and composed a few verses of her own. My albatross awaits me over the wide blue sea, with his feathers all white and his eyes so bright, he will surely set me free. My albatross will greet me with a glass of finest raki. We will feast by night, make love in the moonlight. Of this I can guarantee. But will he love and care for me until the day I cease to be? Will he cherish my heart like his own fine art? Is he really my destiny? Rebecca fell asleep with those lines fluttering about in her head. Roger arrived at Le Vrillon station. He showed a photograph of Rebecca to a few guards, without success. She would have found accommodation somewhere, probably close by. He would search every hostel and hotel in the area, even if it took him all night. He entered many, each time showing the photograph, but nobody recognized her. After an hour he was ready to give up. He was down at the harbour now, where there was a small hotel. He would book in there for the night and decide what he was going to do tomorrow. He went up to the reception desk. "Good evening, sir. Your best room for the night." "Of course, sir. That'll be the harbour suite, room number 28. "Thank you. I don't suppose you've seen this woman, have you? My wife?" He slid the photograph across the desk. The man picked it up. "Yes, indeed, sir. She checked in about 2 hours ago. Room 12. Shall I inform her that—" "No, that's not necessary. We had a little bit of an argument, and I best let her sleep it off. I'll see her in the morning." Roger took his key and mounted the stairs to his room. He examined a plaque on the wall which had the room numbers and which way to go to each. He headed in the direction of room 12. When he found it, he knocked at the door. There was no answer. He tried the handle. It opened, and he went in. She was not in her bed. Her things were there, though. This room did not have a water closet. She would be using the communal one. He sat down on the bed and waited for her to return. There was a pad of paper with some writing on it, on the bedside table. Idly he picked it up and looked at it. He read the poem. Although it talked about an albatross, it made perfect sense. So that's your little game, is it? Well, we'll see about that. We'll just see. He clenched his fists so tightly that it began to hurt. When Rebecca came back to her room, she climbed into bed, turned out the light, and tried to go back to sleep. She had not noticed that the pad was now in a different place than it was when she had put it there. The next morning she came down to breakfast after returning her key to reception. The receptionist asked if she had had a pleasant night, to which she replied that she had, and went into the small dining room. Roger watched her from behind a newspaper. He had told the receptionist not to alert her to his presence. When she left the hotel, he followed her at a distance. She entered the booking office down at the docks. He went in after her, keeping his hat low over his brow. He joined the queue a few people behind her. "Crete," he heard her say. When it came to his turn, he booked himself on the same boat. Rebecca stood on the upper deck, looking out over the water. The wind blew in her hair. She felt exhilarated. She spoke a few words out loud. The fair breeze blew, the white foam flew, the furrow followed free. We were the first that ever burst into that silent sea. Roger watched her. "Keep on dreaming, you little harlot," he hissed. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, as Rebecca made her way up the hill from Alunda harbour. She had the address in her hand. All day she had been imagining how their first meeting would be. She was so excited. She knew now that this was fated, that somehow they had been brought together, two souls connecting. Why else would Roger have planned to take her to Athens? Why else would their relationship be an empty shell? She was supposed to be with Petros. It didn't take her long to find the little house. Her heart was beating, her breath was short. Droplets of sweat accumulated on her brow. She knocked. She waited. Nothing. She was about to knock again when... "He's not in." She turned to see an elderly woman leaning on a stick. "Do you know when he will return?" She shrugged. "I couldn't say. His behaviour has been somewhat erratic recently. But then my son has always been a little odd." "Your son? Petros is your son?" The woman nodded. "Unfortunately." "What do you want with him?" I came to... Are you a love interest?" Rebecca stiffened. "I beg your pardon? You don't look like his type. Prostitutes are more likely." Rebecca flushed red. "Prostitutes?" She could hardly utter the word. "You mean he pays for—" "He pays to be pleasured, not that he has the money to spend. My son is a nobody. Do not waste your time with him." With that, she turned and began hobbling up the hill. Rebecca stood for a long time. She stared after the old woman. Now her heart had stopped beating fast. It was almost not beating at all. Tiny little prickles of emotion began to erupt all over her body. Her dream was disintegrating rapidly. She felt tears rush up into her eyes. She staggered against the wall of the house. The heat was stifling. She collapsed onto the dusty ground. Petros came down from the hills where he had been for a few hours. His way back took him past his mother's apartment. He paused. He had not been to see her for several weeks. Guilt now rose in his chest. He went in. His mother was again in her rocking chair, but the radio was off. "Mother?" "Well, this is a surprise. What have you been up to? Certainly not tending to me. Dr. Karas told me you're up and about now. That's wonderful." "Shut up, Petros." She struggled up from her chair and began shuffling towards him. "You're a failure, my boy. A total and utter failure. You're not worth the pain I went through to give birth to you. How dare you speak to me like that? Hissed Petros. You say that I'm a failure, that I'm a worthless son. Well, you're a worthless mother. I have tried to live my life in the best way that I can, and that has never been enough for you. I'm sorry that Homer is dead, but that is not my fault, and I refuse to be treated as if it is. He turned and headed for the door. I turned your good-looking friend away from your house. I told her not to make the mistake of having anything to do with you. What friend? A dark-haired beauty that was knocking on your door not half an hour ago. What did you say to her? His mother began laughing now. That she wasn't your type. That he preferred the company of prostitutes. What? You didn't think I knew, did you? That was once. I cannot believe that you'd had the nerve to speak to her like that. Whoever she is, she must think I'm utterly appalling now. Well, that's what I think every day. He pointed at her. You're going to pay for this. I swear to God you're going to pay for this. Petros again began walking towards the front door. She was an innocent thing. I didn't want her tarnished by you. So pretty she was, with that nice little jacket and brooch. Petros stopped. He turned back to his mother. Brooch? What kind of brooch? A silver one with birds in it, and a little red stone in the middle. Petros's eyes widened for a split second, and then he ran from the apartment. Rebecca tottered back down the hill. She was barely in control of her own movements now. Her frail dream had been shattered in an instant, in the most cruel way imaginable. And now she had nothing. No hopes for the future. No Petros. How could she go back to her old life after this? When she reached the bottom, there lay the clear blue sea, glistening in front of her. She didn't hesitate. She picked up 2 heavy rocks, one in each hand, and jumped. As she went down, she felt only peace, the knowledge that her pain would be over soon. The seabed had been made for her, and now she would lie in it. Rebecca gasped in air and started coughing violently. Again she felt the hot sun on her wet face. She blinked the salt water out of her eyes. And as those eyes came back into focus, they rested upon a face. A tanned face, with dark hair all wet. They gazed at each other for a while in silence, both of them breathing heavily. Are you all right? Asked Petros at last. She managed to nod. He smiled. Good. I like your brooch. She said nothing. She was lying in this stranger's arms, having obviously been rescued from drowning, and all he could think to say was, I like your brooch. Thank you, she managed to reply. It was a wedding present. I know, said Petros. I made it for you. Rebecca and Petros sat by the water's edge. They stared into each other's eyes. Rebecca held the brooch in her palm. I've been wondering what you would look like, she said. I've also been wondering how we would meet. This wasn't quite what I had in mind. Rebecca looked away now. Your mother? My mother is a horrible woman, said Petros. She hates me. I know what she said to you. I'm so sorry, but none of it is true. The truth is, I can't believe you came. I didn't think you would. She looked at him again. Words struggled on her lips. What is it? Asked Petros softly. Are you happy that I came? Petros nodded slowly. I am overjoyed. Why did you come? I wanted to thank you in person for this brooch. It is... Her voice trailed away. She stared deep into those Grecian eyes. It is perfect, she whispered. Just like you. Petros grinned broadly. I'm sorry, I know that sounds crazy. I don't even know you. No, said Petros. The truth is... Will you walk with me? They walked up into the hills. Petros clasped her small, pale hand in his. The truth is, I am already in love with you. When I first saw your photograph, I thought you were the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. I couldn't concentrate or focus on my work. It was like I had been taken ill, but in a good way. Rebecca smiled. I imagined, through the way your father described you, what it would be like to be with you. I have little experience of women. I have certainly never felt feelings that intense before. The design. Tell me where you got it from. Your father lent me a book of poetry. One of the poems in particular jumped out at me. It was about a seaman who shoots an albatross. I knew it, said Rebecca, stopping short. I knew it. I love that poem with a passion. It is my favourite. And my father never told you to read it specifically? No. What does that mean? That we were always supposed to meet. That all of this was fated. I'm very spiritual, Petros. I believe some things in life are somehow already written. Petros stared at her. I couldn't settle on any design that I came up with. Drawing after drawing went on the floor. It was not until I had given up all hope that it came to me. The idea of the albatross. He brought her hand up to his lips and kissed it. Why did I meet your father that day? Why did he give me that book with your favourite poem? I think you're right. I think this poem has already been written. You saved my life. Now I have returned the favour. So what's the next verse? Asked Rebecca. Good question. Rebecca spun round. Roger was standing by a large boulder, a revolver in his hand. It was pointed directly at Petros. Oh my God. Roger, shut up your mouth, woman. I don't want to hear another word from you. Roger, I said shut up. I saw you at the station in Athens. I followed you. And now I've found out your dirty little secret, you filthy whore. Nobody walks away from me, least of all my wife, and especially not for a peasant. Sir, began Petros. No, you don't speak to me, peasant. I speak to you. If I want you to answer, I'll let you know. You made the brooch, didn't you? A nice piece of work, I'll give you that, but no more than a trinket. And now you think you can run away with my betrothed? I did not know she was coming, sir, I swear. Frankly, I don't care. It's not you I'm angry with. Rebecca began to tremble. She knew his tempers. She knew what he was capable of, and he was very capable of using that revolver. He was a proud soldier. If we put this situation into a military context, you, Rebecca, are a traitor. And you know what happens to traitors, don't you? Don't you? Yes, she said weakly. But this isn't the army. The war has passed. Death is too easy for you, my darling. I want you to suffer as I will suffer, knowing that you left me. The charge exploded from the end of his revolver without warning. There was a very loud bang, and Petros fell backwards onto the ground. Rebecca screamed in sheer and absolute horror. She turned back to Roger in time to see him raise the revolver to his head. She closed her eyes. A few moments later she was cradling Petros in her arms and sobbing uncontrollably. Blood seeped rapidly from his chest. He was motionless. Rebecca screamed out for help at the top of her lungs. It was not long before somebody came. It was Acastus. "Help him!" she shrieked. "Oh, God, help him!" God save thee, ancient mariner, from the fiends that plague thee thus. Why look'st thou so? With my crossbow I shot the albatross. Rebecca sat with her head in her hands as she listened to the surgeon give his diagnosis. He is in a coma. I cannot tell when he will wake from it, perhaps never. He has suffered anoxia, lack of oxygen to the brain. I understand that this is hard for you to hear, madam. All I can suggest is that you stay with him. Talk to him. He will hear you. The nurses will be keeping a close eye on him. We will just have to hope for the best. Rebecca sat for hours by his bedside. At one point she dropped off to sleep, and when she woke, the ward was quiet. She looked at her watch. It was 11 o'clock. She moved her chair closer to his bed and leaned in to whisper to him. "Petros? Petros?" She sighed. "I'm so sorry. It is all my fault." Tears welled up in her eyes. You saved my life, and now I have put yours in jeopardy." The tears overflowed. "I want to tell you something. When I was studying in Oxford, they had a beautiful dining hall. Around the walls were paintings. I liked one of them in particular. Just under it was a table where I would always sit, if it wasn't already occupied. I would stare at the painting for ages. It was an albatross in flight, with the blue sky behind it. That painting, for whatever reason, made me ecstatically happy every time I looked at it. I felt like I was flying with it over that ocean, like I could feel the rush of wind all around me. It represented freedom and boundless hope. I need you, Petros. I need that hope. You cannot leave me now." It was that painting that inspired me to find a poem about an albatross. It's what led me to the Mariner. I want you to know me. I want you to love me with all your heart. I want to read poetry with you, take walks with you. I want to make you happy. I think we need each other. You are my albatross, and I am yours. We will embrace each other with our wings. Inside our breasts burn a fire. It burns so bright and so warm that nothing can extinguish it. We are not two birds, but one." She kissed his forehead. Then she took his hand and squeezed it. And the good south wind still blew behind, but no sweet bird did follow, nor any day for good or play came to the Mariner's hollow. An entire week she spent at his bedside, reading the poem to him. She rarely left the ward. She ate, slept, and prayed by his bed. Another week passed with no change in him. The doctors continued to watch them, but there was nothing they could do. And then one morning he had a visitor, his mother. She hobbled into the ward with her stick and stood over his bed. She stared at him with no emotion in her face. "I know my words to you have been harsh, Petros, but they are nothing less than the truth. You would not have made it in this world, as much as you may have tried. If you can hear me, go to your father and brother, and leave me in peace." At which point she turned from her son forever and walked away. Rebecca sat in a small cafe next to the harbour and stared at the boats. She drank raki and thought about her life. What were her prospects now? If Petros died, she would have no prospects, for she would die with him. It was a decision she had made. In front of her were 5 sheets of paper, upon which she would write her will. She worked on it for an hour, thinking carefully about who should get what. She had no children and no husband. She had cousins, 2 in England and 1 in America. She would leave her considerable fortune to them. But what of the brooch? When she returned to the hospital late in the afternoon, Petros's bed was empty. She stopped short. Her heart leapt into her mouth. She ran towards her where he had lain. She looked around for a nurse, but there was none in the ward. She collapsed onto the chair and covered her face with her hands. He had gone. Her Roman, her Grecian stranger, her Petros had slipped away. Words broke from her lips. Alone, alone, all alone, alone on a wide, wide sea, and never a saint took pity on my soul in agony. "But there is no need to be agony any more," said a voice. It was a voice she knew only too well, soft and tender. She looked up with a gasp. Standing over her, with the aid of a nurse, was her beloved Petros. She rose like a spring from the chair and flung her arms around him. "Careful," he said. "I'm still a little fragile." "I love you," she whispered. "Come home with me to England. We will marry in the local church in Chipping Norton. I want to spend the rest of my life with you, Petros Andreas. "And I with you, Rebecca Dunstan," he replied. Rebecca pulled Petros by the hand as she hurried through her old college campus. It was 3 weeks before the day of their wedding. "Where are we going?" asked Petros. "It's a surprise. I want to show you something." They entered the long dining hall, which was empty. Their hurrying feet echoed through the room. Rebecca came to a stop in front of one of the paintings on the wall. "My professor told me it was still here. Look, the albatross, the one I told you about. You said you heard me." "Yes." Petros stared for a long time at the painting. He didn't speak. The two of them stood, holding each other, both thinking their own thoughts. Petros suddenly smiled. "What is it?" asked Rebecca. "You have spoken before about the idea of fate," he said. Rebecca nodded. "Have you ever had proof of it?" She smiled. "No, I suppose it's more about having faith." "Why?" "Because if you were looking for proof, I think the best place to start looking would be the bottom right-hand corner of this painting." Rebecca frowned. "And what would I find there?" "The artist's name." He smiled and pointed. "This painting was done by my father." Maggie stared at her mother. Everything around her had disappeared. The bustling restaurant, the tourists. She had been holding her martini glass in her hand for some time now, without actually drinking its contents. "That's probably the best story I've ever heard," she said finally. Her mother smiled. Maggie laid down the glass now. "But I always thought Grandad had an English accent." "He did. He went to Oxford and read poetry. He spent the rest of his life surrounded by Englishmen. By the time you came to know him, he was pretty much one of them." Maggie laughed. She drained her martini and shook her head. "My mother insisted that with the brooch should come the poem. The two couldn't be separated. Do you have it?" Her mother again went into her handbag and handed over an envelope. Maggie looked at the box on the table in front of her. She now opened it to find the Albatross Brooch.